On a live primetime broadcast watched by over 18 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Robert De Niro collide in a brutal clash over who truly represents justice in America, the woman who lived it or the man who performed it. De Niro calls her a pawn. She fires back with a 2016 letter he once wrote praising her courage, and then exposes his silence during three of New York's most infamous police killings. In just 3 minutes, she flips the stage from his spotlight to her courtroom. And by the time she's done, he's left speechless, unplugging his mic. Why does Robert De Niro only speak up when it's safe and go silent when it matters most? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio pulsed with electricity. It was 8 p.m. on the dot, prime time, and every major cable network had eyes glued to this feed. Floor lights blasted down on a pristine glass table set at center stage. Behind it sat two names that could not have been more different or more explosive. On the left, Robert De Niro, dressed in sleek gray, a Hollywood icon with decades of fame and a reputation for thundering anti-establishment rants that drew standing ovations. On the right, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising force in the House, known for tearing into hypocrisy with surgical precision, a sharp mind wrapped in relentless fire. The host introduced the theme, artists, politics, and who truly stands for justice. The camera panned wide as the crowd murmured, the tension already thick like storm air before lightning. De Niro cracked a half smile as if this was just another monologue to win. Jasmine didn't move. Her stillness was its own threat. The host leaned forward, voice practiced, but eyes alert. Tonight we ask, who really speaks for justice in America? Is it our elected leaders, shaped by policy and consequence, or the artists who use their platforms to stir conscience and action? Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the host. Robert's fingers drummed lightly on the table, clearly ready to pounce. The imbalance was obvious. De Niro was adored by millions, protected by celebrity. Jasmine was scrutinized, judged. Every syllable she spoke would be dissected. The crowd leaned toward Robert instinctively, their familiarity with him a cushion. For Jasmine, the air was colder, sharper, no benefit of the doubt, no warm welcome, just unspoken pressure to survive or explode. But that pressure didn't crush her, it sharpened her. This was her battlefield. The host turned to Jasmine, a note of polite skepticism in her voice. Congresswoman, some say your tone is too combative, that your presence in Congress is more about noise than substance. How do you respond to critics who think you're too emotional to lead? Jasmine's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Her reply came calm, clear, and blistering. When you grow up watching systems choke your people and call it law, silence isn't noble. It's betrayal. The words sliced through the room like a scalpel. De Niro shifted slightly, caught off guard by the weight of it. But Jasmine wasn't speaking for applause. She was speaking from the burn of lived injustice, from courtrooms, from funerals, from truth no movie ever bothered to capture. The camera zoomed in, no cuts, no music, just the quiet before a detonation. De Niro turned his head, eyes narrowing at Jasmine. For the first time, the audience wasn't sure who held the power in the room. The movie star, who had always commanded attention, or the congresswoman who had nothing to perform and everything to expose. The silence after Jasmine's words wasn't peace. It was pressure, like the moment before a levee breaks. The air was still, but everyone could feel it. Something cruel was coming. Robert De Niro leaned back slowly, his fingers steepled just beneath his chin. The corners of his mouth curled in something between a smirk and a sneer. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The studio was his theater, and he had waited for this cue like a performer savoring the kill shot. Let's not kid ourselves, he said, his voice smooth but loaded, calibrated for the live audience and the millions watching at home. Congresswoman Crockett isn't a threat to the system. She is the system. He paused, letting it hang. They didn't put her in that seat to shake things up. They put her there to quiet the storm, to make you feel like something's changing when it isn't. His eyes flicked toward Jasmine like she was a product on a shelf. Every few years, the machine picks a new face, one that looks different, talks different, but still protects the same gears underneath. Laughter trickled in from the audience, soft at first, then louder. Robert's tone sharpened. She's a symbol, not a soldier, he added. She's not Harriet. She's not Angela. She's not even Shirley Chisholm. She's the hashtag version of revolution. Fast, flashy, and forgotten by next week. Now the crowd was clapping. Some cheered. Others looked unsure but followed the noise anyway. Jasmine didn't move. Not an inch. But the camera caught it. Her jaw clenched just slightly, her right hand tightening into a near fist in her lap. Robert saw it too, and pounced. "You're just another social media politician," he said, turning directly toward her for the first time. "All fire in your feed and hollow in your record. Likes don't legislate. Hashtags don't liberate. And the last thing this country needs is another walking slogan with a seat in Congress." The applause hit harder this time. It rolled through the room like approval for a courtroom knockout, the kind of moment audiences eat alive. But it wasn't just the volume that cut deep. It was the nature of the crowd itself. They didn't know her. They hadn't followed her votes. They hadn't sat through hearings where she cross-examined billionaires or outmaneuvered party veterans. But they laughed anyway, because a famous man said so, because the system they thought she belonged to had already told them to expect fireworks. Not fire. Jasmine, in that moment, was alone in a room full of noise. Alone not because she lacked allies, but because the truth always walks in quietly while arrogance takes the mic. Behind her calm, there was a storm building. Not of anger, but of precision. She had been underestimated before. She had been talked over in chambers, brushed aside in law firms, questioned in courtrooms, and now dismissed on national television like a mascot dressed up as a lawmaker. Robert had spoken like he was unraveling her, but all he had done was light a fuse. Jasmine hadn't flinched because she was already counting the seconds before it would all collapse. And she knew he had just given her everything she needed. The applause that followed Robert's attack was still echoing when the camera cut back to Jasmine. But instead of embarrassment, the lens caught something far more dangerous, a woman sharpening her silence into a blade. Jasmine didn't respond. Not with words, not yet. She sat perfectly still, shoulders square, her head tilted slightly like she was listening to a sound only she could hear. Her eyes remained locked forward, not at the host, not at the audience, not even at Robert, but somewhere deeper, as if she were watching a reel of every room where someone like him had tried to reduce someone like her to a symbol. Her smile was faint, almost imperceptible, but it wasn't soft. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing something the other person didn't. The studio lights caught the edge of her cheek, casting a quiet shadow beneath her jawline. A stillness so composed, so disciplined, it radiated power more than any shouting ever could. The crowd didn't know how to interpret it. The ones who had clapped for Robert were now unsure if they'd won anything at all. The energy shifted, slowly, quietly, like the first vibration before an earthquake. The host, sensing the unease, tried to redirect. Her voice was tight, artificially upbeat. "Let's turn the conversation towards solutions," she offered. "Congresswoman Crockett, what's your stance on justice reform in this moment of national reflection?" But no one was listening to her. Not really. The studio had already turned into a different kind of stage. Not one of debate, but of calculation. And Jasmine was the only one in the room who knew what scene came next. The camera lingered on her longer than usual, catching every micro movement. The slow inhale through her nose, the motionless fingers pressed lightly against her knee, the flicker of recognition behind her eyes like a chess player who'd just seen checkmate 3 moves ahead. She wasn't angry. She wasn't rattled. She had been here before, misunderstood, underestimated, and used as a placeholder for someone else's performance. But this time, she wasn't going to let the moment pass. She wasn't here to play defense. She was here to expose the stage itself, and everyone watching would soon realize it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. But when Jasmine finally leaned forward, eyes locked on Robert like a scalpel on skin, the entire room went still. Not because she was angry, but because she had facts sharper than any insult. "I've listened to you take your swings," Jasmine said, her tone calm, not condescending, not shaken, just calibrated. "And it's interesting How bold you've become in this moment. Loud, certain, condemning. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her posture unshaken. You call Trump inhumane for what he did at the border, and I'm not here to defend that. What happened was brutal. What happened was real. But here's something you conveniently leave out. Those heartbreaking photos of kids in cages. They weren't taken under Trump. They were taken in 2014, when Barack Obama was president. The crowd stopped breathing. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it did. And you, Robert, you weren't angry then. You weren't calling anyone a fascist when it was your guy behind the curtain. You weren't screaming at the cameras when 3 million people were deported under Obama, more than any president in modern U.S. history. She let it sit. The silence wasn't empty. It was cracked with realization. Jasmine's tone deepened, but never lost its composure. You toasted him at award shows. You smiled wide in photo ops. You called him a gentleman, a symbol of hope. Her gaze didn't blink, didn't soften. Hope for who? She asked, her voice now sharpened to a whisper the room had to lean in to hear. Because where I come from, mothers were crying themselves to sleep while ICE pounded on their doors. Kids disappeared from classrooms, deported with their fathers overnight. And you had nothing to say. She didn't blink. Not even a tweet. The injustice wasn't just in what he'd said tonight. It was in what he chose not to say when it mattered. And she was here to remind him, and everyone watching, that silence has fingerprints too. Jasmine let her last words hang in the air like a slow-moving storm, letting them sink not just into Robert, but into every corner of the room. And then, with the same calm edge that had been building since the moment she sat down, she pushed the blade in further, this time into the past he hoped no one remembered. And while we're unpacking silence, Jasmine said, her voice low but steady, let's go back to the 90s. Let's talk about the 1994 crime bill. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was surgical, deliberate, measured, and too precise to ignore. That bill destroyed black communities across this country. It turned addiction into a prison sentence. It handed out mandatory minimums like vending machine snacks. Young men were locked up for decades over a dime bag. Entire families were dismantled. Legally, she didn't blink as she spoke, her words clear and unwavering. And Bill Clinton? He called it justice. He signed it with pride. And you, Robert, you supported him. You spoke at his fundraisers. You stood behind the podium and called him a leader. You helped sell that policy to a country already eager to believe that fear was the same thing as law and order. She leaned back just slightly, not retreating, but letting the gravity catch up. The audience had stopped reacting. No applause now, no murmurs, just breathless silence. You never questioned how that bill would land hardest on people who look like me? Jasmine continued. You never asked what would happen when those communities, already redlined, underfunded, over-policed, were handed over to a system that called punishment progress. Her voice didn't shake, but it deepened, the way a song drops one octave before the drop hits. You had every chance to speak up. You didn't. You chose comfort over confrontation, legacy over lives. She looked straight at him, and this time her tone sharpened into something unmistakably final. When our children were being handcuffed in classrooms, slammed into the pavement, stripped of futures before they hit puberty, you were silent. But when the lights came on, when it was safe, when awards were handed out for speaking truth to power, you stood up, suited up, and gave a speech. She paused just for half a breath. Not for us, but for applause. Jasmine's last words hit like a gavel, and Robert, boxed in by truths he'd never expected to face, didn't retreat. He erupted. But in doing so, he walked straight into the most dangerous part of all, her silence. I'm not a damn politician, Robert snapped, his voice suddenly raw, vibrating with the kind of desperation that doesn't show until the ground starts slipping beneath your feet. His face flushed, brows drawn tight as he slammed his palm down on the table. Not hard enough to look violent, but enough to make the mic jump. I'm not one of you people who sits behind desks and plays with laws like they're Lego blocks. I make art. I create stories that move people. I speak truth in ways most of you can't even understand." The audience stirred. Some clapped out of habit, others shifted in their seats, uncertain if this was righteous anger or a slow unraveling. Robert didn't seem to notice. He pushed forward, his voice rising like a man who knew the spotlight was slipping. "I've been using my platform to wake this country up for years. Before she even held a seat, I was out there calling out fascism. I've taken heat, taken risks, because I care." His words grew louder but also less precise. A crack had formed, small but visible. The kind of crack people in power pretend isn't there until the light starts bleeding through. "I've inspired millions," he went on, his hands gesturing wildly now, as if volume could outrun truth. "I've stood on stages and screamed when no one else would. I've used every bit of fame I had to stand up for what's right." And there it was, the tipping point. The applause he'd once commanded had faded into an uncomfortable quiet, broken only by the nervous cough of someone in the back row. He wasn't talking to Jasmine anymore. He was talking to himself, to the idea of his own importance. The idea that passion, once celebrated, was now somehow protection. But it wasn't. Not here. Not tonight. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't flinch. She watched. Still as stone, unblinking. Not cold, just certain. And when he finally paused, chest heaving slightly, waiting for someone to validate his outburst, she leaned in. Not much. Just enough for the light to catch her eyes. Sharp, patient, resolute. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced the room in half. "Art doesn't stop a bullet." Robert blinked. He hadn't expected her to speak softly. He hadn't expected her to speak at all, not after that explosion. But her restraint was more dangerous than rage. "Art doesn't stop a cop from putting his knee on a man's neck until the breath leaves his body," she said, every word deliberate, every syllable clean. "It doesn't break the silence in a courtroom when the system decides a black boy's life is worth 17 years for a nonviolent offense." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was louder than his fury. "It doesn't hold a mother's hand in the hallway outside a courtroom after she's just watched her child get swallowed by a system she never had a chance to fight." The room was frozen. The cameras had stopped panning. The host sat motionless, eyes flicking back and forth like she was watching a glass wall start to shatter. Jasmine continued, her voice steadier now. Steel wrapped in velvet. "Art is beautiful, powerful even. But it doesn't save people on its own. Not when the people making it only speak when it's safe, when it's trendy, when it gets applause." She locked eyes with Robert now, and this time there was no hesitation. "You've called yourself brave for saying what people wanted to hear in rooms that already agreed with you. But where were you when the pain wasn't performable?" She let that question land, and it did, hard. You could hear the stillness tighten. "Where were you when the 1994 crime bill was destroying my neighborhood, block by block? When ICE raids were tearing families apart under the man you toasted at gala dinners? When kids in my district were getting tried as adults for petty crimes, while you gave standing ovations to presidents who signed the policies that made it possible?" Her tone didn't change. It didn't need to. The truth was doing the work. "You didn't speak out then. You didn't shout. You didn't stand up. You waited. And when the headlines caught up, when the cameras turned on, then you found your voice." Robert's jaw tightened. His fingers were twitching slightly now. Not dramatically, but enough for the close-up cameras to catch. His mouth opened for a second, as if to form a word, but no sound came out. "Art," Jasmine said again, slowly now, "has never been the problem. Silence has." She looked out over the crowd, not to win them, but to challenge them. "Art can inspire, yes, but inspiration without action is performance. And you, Robert, have mastered performance." She leaned back slowly, her posture still composed, still quiet, but every movement carried weight like a falling verdict. "You've stood on stage, in tuxedos, under golden lights, and accepted trophies for playing brave men, for delivering scripted truths. But this," she tapped the desk in front of her gently, "this isn't a movie. This is where real people live and die. And the roles we play out there don't matter if we disappear when the lights go out. The studio was dead silent. Not quiet, silent. A silence that vibrated with pressure, that tasted like something had just shifted, and no one could name it yet. The silence of an audience realizing they'd clapped too soon. Of producers behind the glass whispering into headsets without blinking. Of a man once armored in fame now finding himself exposed not by an attack, but by a mirror. Robert didn't move. Not yet. Not even to look away. And Jasmine didn't wait for applause. Because this wasn't a monologue, it was a reckoning. The silence that followed wasn't stillness. It was recoil, like the breath a crowd takes just before they realize the story they believed in is about to break. Jasmine saw it, and she didn't wait. She made it hurt. Jasmine reached down, calmly, almost without ceremony, and lifted a small tablet from the folder in front of her. No dramatic gesture, no raised voice, just a deliberate motion, controlled, focused, like a prosecutor placing the final piece of evidence on the table. "Let's rewind a little," she said, voice steady, "because I think the people watching tonight deserve to see the full picture of who they're listening to." She tapped the screen once, and the studio monitors flickered to life. The feed switched, not to B-roll, not to generic headlines, but to grainy footage from 2011, a red carpet interview in New York. The background buzzed with flashes, reporters' voices, and the drone of cameras. But the audio was clear. There he was, Robert De Niro, standing outside a charity gala, dressed in a tuxedo, smiling warmly as he told a reporter, "The NYPD are the backbone of this city. I know a lot of great officers. They do a hard job, and most of them do it right." The clip ended. No music, no narration. Just the image of him, on record, defending the very institution that would become the center of a national outrage just 3 years later. Jasmine didn't look at him right away. She let the crowd absorb it, let the timeline lock into place. "That was 2011, she said quietly, eyes on the audience. 3 years before a man named Eric Garner was choked to death by one of those officers he said were doing it right." The room shifted. People sat straighter, some exchanging glances. 3 years before the country watched a cell phone video of a man being killed on a sidewalk, in broad daylight, for selling loose cigarettes. Her voice didn't shake, but it began to deepen, each word heavier than the last. "Garner said, 'I can't breathe,' 11 times. He begged for his life. And the NYPD didn't stop. They didn't help. They didn't answer. They crushed him." Now she turned her eyes to Robert. Her gaze didn't burn. It pierced. "And where were you, Robert?" she asked, voice still low, still composed. "Where was your righteous anger? Your powerful voice?" She leaned forward slightly. "Because I looked. We all did. You didn't tweet. You didn't march. You didn't even whisper." Her jaw tightened just enough to show she wasn't speaking from theory. She was speaking from memory. You had the eyes of the world. You had the mic, and you stayed silent. The audience had stopped reacting entirely, not even a cough, just the slow, collective realization that the man they'd come to cheer wasn't who they thought he was, not in full. Jasmine didn't pause to let them off the hook. She pressed in. "You praised them in 2011. You called them heroes. You called them the backbone of the city. But when they wrapped their arms around Eric Garner's neck and took the air from his lungs, you had nothing to say." Her voice cracked just slightly, not with weakness, but with precision. The crack made it human, made it real. "And now you stand here, tonight, calling me a puppet?" Her hands unfolded, palms open in front of her. "You talk about justice like it's something you invented in a sound booth, like it's a performance you perfected over decades. But I didn't rehearse this." She tapped her chest. "I live it." She let the moment breathe, but only for a second. "You don't get to be silent when it's dangerous, and loud when it's safe," she said, locking eyes with him again. "You don't get to compliment the machine, then pretend you've been smashing it all along. That's not bravery. That's branding." Robert didn't respond. His lips were parted, but no sound came out. Not yet. The weight of the footage, of his own words, his own face, played back for the world to see, had turned the air thick with consequence. The man who'd owned every stage he ever walked on was now sitting on one he couldn't control. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. Her expression was clean, focused, but calm. The kind of calm that comes not from indifference, but from purpose. She had come prepared not to defend herself, but to dismantle the illusion. And this was the moment she exposed its wiring. "You praised the NYPD when it was comfortable," she continued. "And when they murdered one of us, when they took another black man from his family, his children, his community, you turned away. You let the cameras roll past. You let the country forget." Now she finally leaned back, eyes never leaving his. "And tonight, you want to lecture me about justice?" Her tone dipped, not with sarcasm, but with clarity sharpened into something final. "You don't know justice. You've only ever played it." There was no reaction from the host, no attempt to shift topics. She knew, as did every producer behind the glass, that they weren't running the show anymore. Jasmine had taken command without ever raising her voice, without screaming, without rage. Just truth, layered over receipts, delivered with the weight of someone who had waited her whole life to speak in a room this loud. The screen behind them went black again. The clip finished. But the silence it left behind said more than any footage ever could. Jasmine looked around. Not for applause, not for validation, but because she wanted the people watching to feel it, to sit with it, to question the stories they'd believed, the heroes they'd handed the mic to, the people they'd dismissed as too loud when they were simply telling the truth before it was fashionable. She turned back to Robert one last time. Her voice dropped just above a whisper. "You had the world's attention, and you used it to say nothing." The silence after the footage felt like the eye of a storm, calm but only because everything that could be shaken had already started to crack. And just when it seemed Jasmine had fired her final shot, she reached for something that didn't explode. It exposed. She opened a narrow leather folder, quiet as breath, and pulled from it a single folded sheet of ivory paper. Not a prop, not a graphic, not a headline. A letter. Handwritten, neat, worn at the edges. She held it up between two fingers, letting the camera catch it. No theatrics, no over-explanation, just the undeniable power of the real. "There's something I've held on to," Jasmine said, her voice steady, but now touched with something different. Not pain, not anger, but memory. "I didn't expect to bring this out tonight, but since we're talking about performance, about who's real and who's playing parts, maybe it's time everyone saw this too." She unfolded it slowly, carefully. The audience leaned forward instinctively, like watching a courtroom exhibit being entered into evidence. Her fingers smoothed the creases, her eyes scanning the words, not to remind herself, but to place herself back in that moment. 2016. "This is a letter," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "From Mr. De Niro, dated June 22nd, 2016. Hand signed, no publicist, no PR team, just a man who had just watched a congressional hearing." She looked at him now, her eyes no longer defiant, just deeply, unmistakably clear. "The hearing where I sat for 6 hours under hostile questioning about police reform. The hearing where I was mocked, cut off, talked down to, and told I didn't belong in the room. Not because of what I said, but because of who I was." She glanced at the letter, then began to read, every word precise. "I watched your testimony today with awe. The way you held your ground, the way you refused to be shaken. It was powerful. I don't know if I would have had your strength. I truly admire your courage and your calm. You are, without a doubt, one of the most authentic voices I've ever heard in politics." Her voice caught, not from emotion, but from restraint. She looked up, locking eyes with him across the table. "That was you, Robert." The room had gone completely still. The audience was frozen, not in fear or tension, but in witnessing something raw, something true. Even the host's voice had vanished from the ether, as if the entire set had surrendered its authority to whatever Jasmine was about to say next. "You said I wasn't a puppet, that I wasn't playing a role, that I had more strength than you. And you said it when no cameras were rolling, when there was nothing for you to gain. She folded the letter once more, with the same care she'd opened it. So I ask you now, what changed? Her voice dropped a half step, sharpening. Because tonight, you stood in front of the same country and told millions I was a fraud. You accused me of being a symbol, a slogan, a curated voice planted by the system. Her words came slow now, not because she doubted them, but because she wanted every single one to land. You didn't say I was wrong. You said I was hollow. You didn't debate my arguments. You erased my identity. You stripped me of the very integrity you once celebrated, and you did it not because you believe it, but because it fits the part you're playing today. Robert's face was unreadable. For the first time, he looked smaller under the lights. Not shamed, not broken, just caught. Jasmine leaned in again, the room so quiet her words seemed to echo. I didn't bring this letter to embarrass you. I brought it to remind you of who I am and of who you used to be when nobody was watching. Her voice was soft but steel-lined. You knew then what you pretended not to know tonight. A pause. Intentional. Surgical. You knew I wasn't an actor. That line didn't explode. It didn't need to. It settled like ash after a fire, covering everything in quiet evidence. She set the letter down gently, then turned her palms upward. An offering, not a performance. I've never needed Hollywood to tell me I was real. I've never waited for applause to speak the truth. And I sure as hell don't need anyone, even you, to give me permission to keep fighting. The air in the studio felt thick, charged. No cue cards could guide what came next. No pre-written segments could stitch this moment back into a safe broadcast. The host opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Jasmine sat back slowly, the posture of someone who had said exactly what she came to say. Nothing more, nothing less. And somewhere, beneath the heat of the studio lights, the lines between actor and advocate, between memory and motive, between the Robert who wrote that letter and the Robert sitting here now, blurred into something neither applause nor silence could fix. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about history, and Jasmine Crockett had just placed it in plain view. The letter sat on the desk like a ghost, undeniable, intimate, damning. But for Robert, it wasn't the content that broke him. It was the fact that she dared to show it, and in the span of a breath, his mask cracked. You don't have the right, Robert barked, the words sharp and sudden, punching through the silence like a fire alarm in a cathedral. His hands slammed the edge of the table, rattling the water glass beside him. That was private. That was a personal letter. Written to you, not to be paraded in front of America like a weapon. His face had turned a mottled red, his chest rising and falling in short bursts. The carefully groomed composure, the steady activist artist persona he wore like a tuxedo, had been ripped off, thread by thread. And what stood in its place was something raw, exposed, and furious. That wasn't for the cameras, he shouted again, voice cracking slightly now. You don't get to twist something I said in confidence, not to win a debate. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't move. They watched frozen, not because they didn't understand his outrage, but because something in it felt off, not noble, not righteous, just desperate. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her hands were still folded calmly in front of her, as if she were waiting for a bell to finish ringing in a courtroom. And when she spoke, her voice was like ice poured slowly over fire. You're angry, she said quietly. Not because I lied, but because I told the truth when it was no longer convenient for you. She let the words breathe. Let them find their mark. You're not upset about the letter. You're upset that I reminded the world of who you used to be, when you didn't need to perform outrage for a crowd. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power came not from volume, but from clarity. The clarity of someone who had seen this exact kind of man fold in exactly this kind of room. Robert opened his mouth again, but Jasmine lifted a single hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop him in his tracks. I get it, she said. You thought tonight would be easy. You thought you'd show up, throw some lines, land a few applause breaks, and walk away the hero. Her gaze hardened inch by inch. But when the mirror got turned around, when you were the one being held accountable, you couldn't handle it. She reached out and gently tapped the folded letter once with two fingers. This wasn't a betrayal. This was a receipt, a reminder that once, in a quiet room, you respected me not because you had to, but because you saw something real. Her voice tightened. And now when the audience changed, so did your respect. There was a pause, a slow, deliberate silence. Then Jasmine leaned forward, voice dropping low, words hitting like quiet detonations. Privacy, she said, is not a shield for hypocrisy. Not when you use your voice to undermine the very people you once praised. Not when you rewrite your truth because tonight's audience claps for a different version. Robert swallowed hard, visibly shaken now, blinking fast like someone trying to recover ground that had already collapsed beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. Jasmine didn't wait for permission to continue. She wasn't asking. You want to talk about boundaries? She said. Let's talk about the boundary between private integrity and public performance, between who you are when the cameras are off and who you pretend to be when they're on. She narrowed her gaze, because that's the line you crossed tonight. Not me. The audience wasn't breathing, or if they were, it was silent. The kind of breath you take during a verdict, not an interview. Jasmine leaned back slowly, never breaking eye contact. You knew exactly what that letter said when I pulled it out. You remembered every word, not because it was some casual fan note, but because it came from a real place, a human place. Her tone softened for a beat, not in mercy, but in truth. And I remembered it too. I carried it. Not for leverage, for proof that what I've fought for, what I've endured, was seen, even by you. She tapped the letter once more, almost reverently. But now I realize, you weren't angry because I shared your words. You were angry because those words still shame you. A final pause. Then with a precision that didn't need to be loud to be lethal, Jasmine delivered the blow. You say I stole a private moment, but the only thing I exposed was your reflection. And this time, no one clapped. Because no one dared to pretend this was just another debate. The truth had been spoken, not screamed, and somehow that made it heavier. Robert wasn't just losing an argument, he was losing control of the stage he once commanded. And when men like him run out of words, they don't fight, they flee. Robert reached up slowly, almost like a man coming out of anesthesia, and fumbled with the clasp of his mic. His hands trembled, not violently, but just enough to betray the storm beneath his skin. The tension in the room didn't burst, it tightened. With a low static pop, the microphone came free from his lapel. His eyes didn't meet Jasmine's. They didn't meet the host's. They didn't meet anyone's. They wandered, up, then down, then toward the floor, like he was looking for a way out that didn't involve walking. But there was no side door, no script to return to. Just silence, and shame, and the sharp memory of every applause he'd ever mistaken for conviction. He stood slowly, shoulders heavy, breath shallow. And the room, once primed to cheer his every word, now watched with something closer to disbelief. Not at what Jasmine had said, but at how completely he had unraveled under the weight of it. No one clapped. Not one hand moved. Even the lights above seemed frozen, unsure whether to soften or glare. The host, visibly panicked behind her trained smile, leaned forward, gripping her cue cards like a life raft. "We're going to take a short break," she said, her voice wobbling at the edges. "Just a few moments to regroup and we'll return shortly with—" "No," Jasmine said, not shouted, not snapped, just spoken, clean, precise, immovable. The host turned to her, startled, as did the cameras, which instantly adjusted their framing, as if they too sensed where the center of gravity now lived. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her posture relaxed but grounded, eyes locked forward with the calm of someone who had been through far worse storms than a celebrity's tantrum. She let the pause stretch, just long enough for her next words to become the only thing the audience would remember. "There's no need for a break," she said. The truth doesn't need a commercial. The sentence hit like a depth charge. Quiet, controlled, devastating. Someone in the second row exhaled audibly, the kind of breath that escapes when the body forgets how long it's been holding everything in. Robert hadn't left yet. He was still standing there, mic in hand, face unreadable. But his eyes were hollow, not from guilt, not even from anger, from exposure. He had shown up with his image. Jasmine had brought the evidence. And the difference between the two had just rewritten the atmosphere of the entire studio. The host tried to recover, flipping her cards like they might offer rescue. Perhaps just a minute to reset, she began again, weaker this time. But Jasmine turned her head toward her. Not harshly, not dismissively, just directly. If we pause now, she said, we tell the world that accountability is too much for prime time. That honesty is something we need to cushion. That power should always be given space to retreat when challenged. She turned slightly, just enough for the cameras to capture her face in full. But some of us don't get commercial breaks. Some of us don't get to walk away when things get uncomfortable. Her voice remained calm, but the firmness behind it hardened like steel. I've spent my life being told to wait, to quiet down, to make space for others to feel safe before I speak. She looked toward the studio audience, not seeking their agreement, demanding their reflection. But justice doesn't come with a 5-minute intermission, and dignity isn't something you hold until the next cue card. Robert still hadn't moved. His hands had lowered to his sides now, the mic dangling like a broken necklace. His mouth was slightly open, as if still searching for a line that might save face. But there was nothing left in the script that could rescue this moment, because this wasn't theater anymore. This was reckoning. Jasmine leaned slightly forward in her seat, her voice a whisper now, but the kind of whisper that made people lean closer, not turn away. We don't need a break, she said again, slowly. We need to stop pretending truth only matters when it's comfortable. No one argued, not the host, not the crew, not even Robert. And in that silence, that raw, stretched, breathless silence, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She reclaimed the stage. The mic hadn't dropped. It had been laid down. But the echo still roared across the country. And within hours, the headlines did what headlines always do: twist, weaponize, and immortalize. The next morning, the fallout wasn't slow. It was instant and everywhere. Cable news ran the footage on a loop. Robert's face pale and stunned, eyes avoiding the camera. Jasmine sitting still, spine straight, words like scalpels. The split-screen image wasn't just a moment. It was a message. Progressive outlets ran with it first. Crockett redefines live debate, turns talk show into takedown. A star fades, a voice rises. No notes, no shouting, just facts. Jasmine Crockett just gave America a masterclass. More conservative voices tried to reframe it, but even they couldn't ignore the shift. De Niro brought emotion. Crockett brought receipts. Robert De Niro, silenced by his own history. She didn't just debate him. She disarmed the myth. And then came the quotes. From anchors, from activists, from stunned late-night hosts unsure whether to joke or apologize. The line that rang loudest and hardest came from a Washington Post editorial. Robert De Niro stayed silent when it mattered most. Jasmine Crockett reminded America that the truth doesn't need permission. It just needs a voice. Social media exploded. Clips of her dismantling his NYPD praise went viral. Her reading of his 2016 letter, clipped into a 30-second reel, had racked up 12 million views by noon. Even the quietest of commentators had to admit something seismic had happened on that stage. Not just a confrontation, a reckoning. But the moment wasn't finished until she closed it. And she knew it. The final segment had been trimmed by the network. Time was tight. Ratings had peaked. Advertisers were nervous. But Jasmine didn't care. She wasn't speaking to them anymore. She was speaking to the country that had watched her be doubted, disrespected, and dismissed. Again. And still, she hadn't moved. The host leaned forward one last time, voice soft now, like someone treading carefully across thin ice. Congresswoman Crockett, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing? Jasmine looked straight ahead, not into the camera, not at the host, not even at Robert, now long gone, somewhere behind the curtains of silence. She looked into the space that lived between America's ears, the space where illusions grow, the space where injustice hides behind fame and truth gets talked over by clout. And then she said it, not loud, not rushed, just enough to be remembered. I don't need you to agree with me. Her words landed like a heartbeat that everyone had forgotten they were holding. I don't need your applause. I don't need your endorsement. I don't need your validation. She turned slightly, just enough for the audience to see her, not as a congresswoman, not as a guest, but as the only person in the room who had not performed that night. I need you to stop pretending that people like him are heroes for saying what we've been screaming for generations. Only after it becomes safe, her tone sharpened, not angry, just surgical. Because what I saw tonight wasn't justice. It was a man trying to wear our pain like a costume, trying to teach a class he never attended, trying to rewrite his silence into activism. The studio lights hummed, the audience held still, and she ended it, clean, final, immovable. I don't need him to agree with me, she repeated, but I will not let him play the role of justice on the backs of our real suffering. A pause, a stillness, a close, and then nothing. No clapping, no music, just truth. Sitting in the center of the stage, unbought, unshaken, and unedited. The lights dimmed and the audience exhaled, but no one truly moved. Because even though the segment had ended, the real weight of what happened hadn't even begun to settle. This wasn't just a live debate. It had become a national mirror, and the reflection wasn't easy to look at. In the hours that followed, the internet did what it always does: clipped, cropped, captioned, and consumed. Millions watched Jasmine's words from their couches, their offices, their phones. But beneath the hashtags and headlines, something else began to rise. Not noise, not division, reckoning. Because what Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just confrontational, it was surgical. She peeled back the fabric of performance, stripped away the comfort of polished outrage, and asked a question America hates answering out loud. Who do we really listen to when the room gets quiet? De Niro had the spotlight, Jasmine had the scars, he had the platform, she had the proof. And in that brutal, unplanned collision, something undeniable was revealed. Fame can't substitute for conviction, and good intentions mean nothing when they're buried beneath years of strategic silence. The lesson wasn't just for Robert, it was for every viewer who ever asked, why are they still angry? For every newsroom that booked a celebrity instead of an expert, for every classroom that taught civil rights as if it were ancient history, for every voter who claimed to care, but only when it was easy, because what Jasmine exposed was more than hypocrisy. It was a pattern, a generational pattern of voices being elevated only after the fight is over, of people waiting to speak up until the story is safe, the facts are vetted, and the crowd is already cheering. Robert wasn't the first. He won't be the last. But he became the most visible reminder that in a world obsessed with sounding right, far too few ever stand right. And Jasmine, she never raised her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch when Robert's tone turned defensive, then desperate, then defeated. Because she's lived through louder storms. She's survived rooms colder than that stage. And every time someone told her she was too angry, too aggressive, or too emotional, she kept showing up anyway. Not for permission, but for justice. And that's the heart of this human lesson. True justice isn't cinematic. It's not a monologue. It doesn't wear a tux or carry a golden statue. It looks like a woman being talked over 5 times in one sentence and still finishing her point. It sounds like a calm voice reading a letter that was never meant to be read, because some truths refuse to stay buried. It feels like the pause after a line like, "You don't get to play the role of justice on the backs of our pain." That wasn't poetry. That was reality, sharpened to a blade. And for many watching, it wasn't just Jasmine on that stage. It was every time they'd been dismissed, every time their story was co-opted, every time someone louder, richer, and whiter was praised for repeating what they'd been punished for saying first. The injustice wasn't abstract, it was personal, and Jasmine held it, not with vengeance, but with grace. She didn't need Robert to fall apart. She needed America to wake up, to remember that the civil rights movement wasn't made by celebrities, that the people who changed history were often never interviewed, that the most powerful words ever spoken in this country came from porches, pulpits, prison cells, not press junkets, and that maybe, just maybe, we've been listening to the wrong people for far too long. Because here's the truth. You don't need to be famous to matter. You don't need to be polished to speak truth. And you definitely don't need a script to hold someone accountable. Jasmine Crockett reminded America that you don't have to look like power to own the room. She did it with memory, with receipts, with composure that didn't just hold, it commanded. And in doing so, she gave every person who's ever been interrupted, underestimated, or erased a moment of radical clarity. You don't need their permission to be real. You don't have to wait your turn. You don't have to soften your edges to make them comfortable. You don't have to smile when they lie. You just have to speak and let the truth do the rest. The human lesson wasn't about celebrity, it was about currency, what we value and why. And Jasmine proved that in this country, too often we confuse fame with fact, volume with vision, presence with purpose. But those illusions shattered under the weight of her calm, and the message left behind was unshakable. If your voice only rises when the crowd agrees, it's not courage, it's choreography, and America's pain is not your stage. So no, Jasmine Crockett didn't humiliate Robert De Niro. She held up a mirror and asked him, and us, a question we don't ask enough. When it really mattered, where were you? It's a question we'll all face, eventually. And when that moment comes, we won't be judged by our likes, our followers, or our filmography. We'll be judged by what we said when it would have been easier to say nothing. The cameras had stopped rolling. The studio had gone dark. But across the country, something had been set in motion. Not a scandal, not a meme, a reckoning. And now that the illusion was shattered, the question that remained wasn't for Robert. It was for us. This wasn't about who won the debate. This was about who remembers it tomorrow. Because the truth Jasmine Crockett delivered doesn't live in headlines. It lives in decisions. What you do next decides what this moment actually means. Not just for politics, not just for television, but for you. What happened on that stage wasn't performance. It was a warning that justice is being sold in pieces, that truth is being outbid by fame, that we've spent too long mistaking influence for integrity. And now the bill is coming due. And no, there won't be another commercial break. Jasmine didn't rise from struggle so we could retweet and forget. She didn't drag her history into the light so we could watch from the comfort of apathy. She fought to remind us, every single one of us, that silence, even dressed in a designer suit, still leaves blood on the floor. So if your heart was pounding as she spoke, good. If your stomach twisted when Robert looked away, good. That discomfort is the beginning of awakening. Don't numb it. Don't dismiss this as just politics. Don't wait for someone else to say what you already know. If you felt something, do something. Because you don't need a title to make change. You don't need to be invited to the table to flip it over. You don't need permission from power to speak like you matter. You just need one thing, the refusal to accept what you know is wrong. It starts in your house, in your community, at your school board. It starts with who you vote for, who you hold accountable, who you stop excusing just because they share your party or your playlist. It starts with asking, whose voices am I ignoring? Just because they're not famous? Whose suffering am I applauding? Only when a celebrity repeats it with a script. We've been raised to listen to voices that sound polished. We've been trained to trust the people who smile at cameras, not the ones who yell into them. But Jasmine flipped that logic on its head. She didn't come dressed as a savior. She came armed with memory, with proof, with the names and faces of those America forgets until a tragedy goes viral. And she dared to say, your applause doesn't heal our wounds. Action does. So here's what action looks like. Show up, not just online, In person, in town halls, in courtrooms, in protest lines and petition booths. When your school whitewashes history, speak up. When your favorite artist ignores injustice, call it out. When your family jokes about politics, educate, don't escape. Stop treating allyship like a fashion statement. Stop assuming your timeline is enough. And for God's sake, stop waiting until the perfect moment. There is no perfect moment. There's only this one. And whether you act or not, injustice keeps moving. If you don't speak, it wins. If you don't interrupt, it gets comfortable. If you stay seated, it grows teeth and bites the people you claim to love. Jasmine Crockett didn't expose Robert De Niro to destroy him. She exposed him to show us what happens when we confuse visibility for virtue, when we let people hide behind good intentions and old headlines, when we allow actors to take credit for activism they never lived. The real leaders? They're already bleeding, already marching, already buried in court transcripts and community trauma. They don't need your likes. They need your backbone. Because the truth doesn't survive on its own. It survives when people are brave enough to carry it, to speak it when the room grows cold, to repeat it when the crowd looks away. If Jasmine could hold her ground on that stage, with the nation watching, you can hold yours in a classroom, in a board meeting, in your kitchen. If she could face decades of gaslighting with a calm voice and steady hands, then you can face your neighbor, your boss, your silence. And if you don't, then the lie wins. Then history repeats. Then children grow up thinking justice is a costume you wear at award shows, instead of a fight you choose every single day. So what will you do? Will you go back to scrolling? To pretending this was just entertainment? To laughing off the truth because the volume dropped and the host smiled? Or will you remember? Remember that real change starts in moments like this. Messy, awkward, unscripted, and absolutely necessary, because power never surrenders itself. It has to be confronted, interrupted, dismantled. And you're not too small to do it. You're not too poor, not too busy, not too quiet, not too late. You just have to decide to believe that your voice, shaky or strong, can shift something, that your vote, local or national, can block something, that your stance, lonely or loud, can change something. And when the next Jasmine walks into a room full of cameras and knives, you'll have already cleared a path. You'll be the one who said, I didn't wait for justice to trend. I made it move. So rise, not for her, with her, and never again behind her. Because the fight doesn't belong to the famous, it belongs to the fearless. And now, it belongs to you. You've heard the call. You've seen the truth. But even now, after the lights, the fire, the fallout, there's one thing left that no one on that stage said out loud. Not because they forgot, but because it was too sacred to say until the end. The most radical act of all is to believe your voice matters. In a world trained to dismiss you, to flatten your story into background noise, to shrink your anger into overreaction, there is no braver sentence than, I will not be silent. That's what Jasmine Crockett carried into that studio. Not a campaign, not a brand, a promise. One carved out by generations of people who weren't invited to the table, so they built their own. One forged by Black mothers who knew justice didn't live in speeches, but in the way they kept breathing after burying their sons. One held up by truth-tellers who never got a movie deal, but got the facts right. And now it's your turn to carry it. Because this fight is not a moment, it's a movement. And movements are made not by legends, but by witnesses. The ones who see what's wrong and refuse to look away. We are not here to admire the fire Jasmine lit. We are here to feed it. Let it burn through the excuses. Let it scorch the rot of performative justice. Let it light the path forward, not paved in fame, but in accountability. And yes, it will cost you. Truth always does. You will lose friends. You will be called too much. You will be mocked for caring when others are busy clapping for the enemy in a nicer suit. But you will also gain something far greater, a voice that doesn't flinch. Because once you speak truth, real truth, the kind that shakes rooms and shatters illusions, you don't go back. You don't laugh at injustice for clout. You don't forget the names of the dead. You don't apologize for being louder than their lies. And suddenly you become dangerous, not to people, but to power. Because power fears the unpolished, the unsilenced, the people who don't wait to be asked, the people who, like Jasmine, walk into a room rigged against them and rewrite the rules anyway. That is the future this country needs. Not more saviors, not more slogans. More people like you, done with waiting, because silence is no longer neutral. It's the stage upon which injustice performs. Robert De Niro walked off that stage in silence. Jasmine Crockett walked off having planted a seed, and now that seed is yours. What will you do with it? Will you water it with more outrage, but no action? Will you bury it under distractions and doubt? Or will you grow something bigger than yourself? Something that doesn't need applause to matter. Something that doesn't fade with the news cycle. Something that speaks for the children who never got to grow up. For the names the headlines mispronounced. For the truth that came too late, but still came. Because justice doesn't expire. It waits. And then it demands. It demands that we remember. It demands that we show up again. It demands that we choose to be more than just viewers. So this is the last thing Jasmine left unsaid. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was meant for you to finish. This isn't about me. It's about who comes after me, and whether the path I cleared stays open or gets closed again. So hold the door open. For the next voice who gets laughed off stage. For the next truth they call too radical. For the next moment when silence is easier, but not braver. Let your voice be the echo they didn't expect. Let your action be the weight that tips the scale. Let your courage be contagious. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.